Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. This time around, we've got Sharks defenseman Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and I'm going to address the elephant in the room here. There are a lot of Sharks fans who aren't a huge fan of Marc-Edouard Vlasic as a player, at least not over these past few seasons, and so they will likely sort of be leaning more towards the more terrible grades for him this season, D minus, perhaps even an F. And so the grade that I have given him might seem like I've gone a bit too easy on Vlasic. Now, I can understand why there would be a lot of dislike here. Vlasic was an elite defenseman, one of the best in the world, at least at what he did best in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that amazing playoff run with the San Jose Sharks in 2016, where he shut down the Kings' top scorers in the first round, the Predators' top scorers in the second round, the Blues' top scorers in the third round, and even did a great job at shutting down the Penguins' top goal scorers in the fourth round. Unfortunately, the Penguins were just too deep of a team, and the Sharks' third defensive pairing fell apart, and we know the story there. But Vlasic himself was doing a fantastic job throughout that entire playoff, so he had some extremely high highs, but over these last few seasons, he has been quite bad, simply just not really being able to do the things that he used to be able to do. And the thing is that Vlasic has never really been a very physical type of player. He has always only been imposing on the ice just due to his strong defensive positioning and high defensive IQ, and with those aspects having failed him now, he doesn't even have that imposing presence on the ice to really make forecheckers think twice about going into the corner with him, and so he's not really bringing a lot to the table from a defensive perspective. He's not, of course, the first Sharks player who hasn't been very good and yet has been continuing to get ice time. There have been many such players over these last few seasons, but really what separates Vlasic from the pack and what makes him more of a disliked player amongst others is the fact of his contract. Vlasic is making and has been making $7 million per season for each of these last few years, and at no point during this contract has he actually been worth those full $7 million. It's gone up and down, but over these last couple of seasons at the very least, he's been barely league minimum in terms of actual worth as a defenseman. Most teams probably wouldn't even have him in their top six in the NHL, and yet he's making so much money, and his contract has really had sort of kept the Sharks' hands tied with the flexibility that they have been able to have with their cap situation. So those two aspects together, Vlasic not playing particularly well and his really bad contract, has left a lot of people soured about him as a player. Again, extremely understandable situation, but the fact is, when it comes to my grade, yes, Vlasic started this season off very poorly, and he also ended the season quite poorly as well. There was a stretch of games through this year in which Vlasic was actually pretty good, and I'm not even saying in the sense of, oh, he was barely able to crack an NHL lineup, but he was actually serviceable in a top 4 role for the San Jose Sharks, which was probably the biggest surprise of the season for Vlasic to have managed to string together multiple games. We're talking probably about a full month's time in which Vlasic was actually looking quite decent, and this is where he did the majority of his scoring this season. 57 games played, 6 goals, 6 assists for 12 points is not a particularly impressive score line for himself, but he's never been a highly offensive defenseman, at least not since like his first few years in the NHL. He's always been someone who has had a limited amount of scoring for the team, so it's not that much of a surprise to see a 12 points in 57 games. So most of that scoring, like I said, coming through that strong stretch of play in the middle of the season. But I think the most notable part here of that stat line is actually the 57 games played. This is the least amount of games played that Vlasic has had in his career outside of those shortened seasons, 12-13 when that was shortened for the lockout, only played 48 games, and then in 21-22 the situation with COVID that they made it so that they only played 56 games. I think that was actually in 2021, but outside of those 2 years, this is the least amount of games Vlasic has played, and it is not due to some massive injury that kept him out for an extended period of time, but instead was David Quinn actually healthy scratching him for many games this past season. I disagreed with a lot of the lineup choices that Quinn made throughout this year, but this is the one that I definitely did agree with. Vlasic was certainly not deserving of being in the lineup every single night, and seeing him get healthy scratched felt very justified for how he was playing. Of course, Vlasic extremely upset about that, as we know now. Maybe one of the reasons, at least played into a part for why David Quinn ended up getting fired, as Vlasic was not particularly happy with him. Hopefully that doesn't mean that Vlasic is going to get more games next season, because he should continue to be a healthy scratch, and in fact less games should very well be in Vlasic's future. But again, it is notable that he only ended up playing 57 games, but it should also be said that when Vlasic was on that role, it's not as though he was ever taken out of the lineup randomly as a healthy scratch. He was playing well. Quinn rewarded him for that reason. It was simply when he was playing terribly, which was for the majority of the season, that he ended up dropping those games. When it moves over to the plus-minus here, a -27, it doesn't look that terrible for a defenseman on the San Jose Sharks this season, but there are a couple of factors to consider. The first of which is because Vlasic didn't play all 82 games, or at least close to all 82 games, there was less of an opportunity for that plus-minus to drop even further. When you compare to other defensemen who are up at 70-plus games on the season, Vlasic missing a good chunk of it means that he probably would have finished down in like a -40 had he had a full 82-game season. It should also, of course, be noted that Marc-Edouard Vlasic doesn't face other teams' top competition. That's usually in line for a Mario Ferraro or even like a Jan Ruda defensive pairing. Vlasic usually gets the much easier matchups throughout the game, and so to see him still get so heavily outscored at even strength is not a great thing. And then when it comes to his time on ice, 16 minutes and 17 seconds, that is not a career low. That actually happened a couple of years ago on the San Jose Sharks, but it is more than a full minute less than what David Quinn was giving him last season. So clearly Quinn saw what he did in 22-23 and said, Vlasic is nowhere near where he should be, and ended up playing him less and less for this past year for himself. So indeed, a downward trend in terms of ice time, which should realistically continue as we play out the last couple of seasons of Marc-Edouard Vlasic's contract. And so when we get to a grade, like I said, I know a lot of people are going to jump at and try to immediately give him like a D, a D-, perhaps even an F, because Vlasic, just as a player, has been one of the most disappointing factors of the San Jose Sharks falling off as a team. Vlasic's fall off has been much more publicized and much more talked about and much more at the forefront than anybody else's. But because of that decent stretch of games that he did have, that 15 to 20 games month time in which he actually looked quite good, he still ends up with a bad grade, but not nearly as bad as it could have been, with a C-.